freedom of speech is a fundamental right. It's a fundamental human right. But I'll tell you something else.
Our Heritage Minister has put together a team of experts who are charged with informing the government on how to best craft some online hate legislation.
Of our expert advisory group on online safety.
The minister tells us that Canadians are subject to harm and even violence, if I understand him correctly, by viewing comments that are deemed hateful.
Much more likely to be exposed to and hurt by unacceptable, hateful content.
That this is a safety problem and that government's number one priority should be protecting the safety and security of Canadians. So to this end, the minister is going to enact some legislation that I guess is going to make it illegal to publish hate online in comments or comments that are deemed hateful. Now, he doesn't, of course, define what hate speech means or what the threshold will be, but he tells us that there are several Canadians who, because of negative comments that they might get online, are hesitant to even post things online.
Actually, there's a lot of people that don't want to share what they think anymore. They're afraid of going online and speak freely because of the comments, the negative and violent reaction they may get.
He also tells us that this seems to disproportionately affect racialized Canadians and people of other visible minorities. And this legislation, we're told, will protect these individuals to express themselves online and be free from any hateful comments that what they post online might ordinarily be subject to.
An online space for all Canadians that is inclusive, respectful, and free from harm.
Now, our minister tells us that somehow this is not going to violate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So on the one hand, we're going to be protected from things that we find hateful or just troubling, whatever that means. Yet still, on the other hand, Canadians' freedom to express themselves freely is somehow not going to be affected by that.
And I think in some ways, this will really help freedom of speech in that sense.
I'd be surprised to see how he does that. To me, either this is going to be largely effective in its purported aim to get rid of speech that's deemed hateful and therefore will necessarily infringe on people's rights to express themselves. And on that note, a lot of people say, well, but if it's just hateful speech, like no one's in favor of that, why not curtail people's rights in that very narrow definition? And it's a good question. I mean, anyone who spent any time online knows that there are vile things that you can find, hateful things, bigoted things. People are often not at their best online. You don't need to go very far to realize that. The question is, what constitutes hatefulness and who gets to decide? And there's a larger question here as well. Does speech actually harm people? If I read a comment that's not kind to me, have I been harmed? It sure sounds like our minister is saying, yes, I would be harmed, and somehow he's implying I have a right not to be harmed by seeing those sorts of comments. Now, his plan is to set up a bureaucracy, some sort of quasi-judicial board that will, look at online hate or complaints and then compel online platforms such as Facebook and Google and YouTube and the like, and force them to take down comments that are deemed hateful. Now you may have noticed that just the other day he introduced different legislation that will tax those very same platforms and take the money from them and redistribute it to the mainstream news media here in Canada. And I don't know if this for sure, but perhaps he will use that legislation to enforce the anti-online hate speech regulations. I'm not sure exactly how this is going to work. He's pretty vague on the details, other than assuring us that Canadians won't have to be subjected to hate, yet somehow will still have the freedom to express themselves.
Freedom of speech is a fundamental right. It's a fundamental human right. But
this is new territory, I think, for a modern liberal democracy. Years ago in Europe, like centuries ago, during the time of the Reformation and the decades that followed, there was lots of legislation. They didn't call it anti-hate legislation, but it was basically anti-heresy legislation, where in those days there's different church factions. There's the Catholic Church, the mainline Reform movement, and the Reform movement itself fractured into different churches, and each of them had their own doctrine, their own truth that they believed described the universe. And because the church was very much linked with the secular authorities in those days, if someone uttered speech that ran contrary to the church's official doctrine, they would be subjected to civil penalties, some cases torture or losing property, and in extreme cases death or torture and death. So it wasn't pretty, and this lasted a long time in that era until finally some philosophers came along and kind of wondered whether this is the way to go about things. And although he came, I think, a little bit later, John Locke spoke a lot about this, and he believed that each human being has basically natural rights. Being a reasoning being, that human beings have the right to freedom of conscience and freedom of thought, and as an extension, freedom of expression, and that it is not the place of the state to try to curtail those rights. Jesus in the Gospels said something similar. He was tested about whether or not he and his followers should pay taxes, and he gets, a Roman coin, and he asks, I think there's slightly different accounts depending on which gospel you're looking at, but he asks his questioner whose face is on the coin. And the person answers, well, it's Caesar's face that's on the coin. And Jesus says, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar, or give to the government what is the government, but give to God what is God. And that, I think, is part of where we get this idea of a separation of church and state, that things like my speech and how I talk about and how I talk to my fellow human beings, that's something that I'm answerable to God about, not the civil authorities. So I think when we have legislation like this that we're told will be enacted soon, it seems that it is the state that is now beginning to want to prosecute people for what is effectively heresy. If you don't follow the predominant narrative, you might be subject to these heresy laws. And I think that's dangerous. And again, I'm not saying that online hate is a good thing. I think it's a bad thing. But I don't think it is something that the civil authorities have the right to prohibit. For a number of reasons. One of them is, what makes us think that's going to be effective? So let's suppose there is a bigoted person out there, and he holds some vile thoughts about a certain race, and he makes some vile comments about that said race. And now the government comes along and takes down those comments. Okay, is he any less racist? Has he learned the errors of his way? Or do those feelings fester and maybe go underground and maybe manifest somewhere else? Are we really solving the problem by trying to control people's speech, or are we introducing even new problems? These ideas of freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom of expression, they're not brand new. They've been around for several hundred years now and have informed how we manage our society. And it could be tempting to say we're in a new era and it might be time to abandon those. But we need to think about what we're abandoning and question about where that might lead us. Perhaps it will lead us into a good new place, but perhaps not. And we should be circumspect about anyone who tells us that for sure by banning hate speech is going to lead us someplace good, because in my opinion, at least, there's at least some probability that could take us into some pretty dark places.